Okay, everyone, we're going to get started. I'm sure that there will still be people filtering in, but we only have 45 minutes, so we're going to try to, get through everything we can. So welcome to this session of Together Ensemble. This is Canada's conference devoted to tracking progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. Thank you for joining our discussion on the mental health impacts of climate change and sustainable solutions. I would like to start the session with a land acknowledgement. Two of the panelists and I work at the University of Waterloo, or UW, which is situated on the Haldeman Tract, land promised to the Six Nations. This includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. It is the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Tarek studies at the University of Toronto, or U of T, which is situated on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The treaty that was signed here is collectively referred to as the Toronto Purchase. Kieran conducts their work on the traditional unceded territories of Kanyankahaka, or the Mohawk Nation. This land has been known as Chiochake for thousands of years prior to receiving the name Montreal. As settlers, we must acknowledge the history and current lives of Indigenous peoples. It is important for us to consider the UN's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, as we discuss the climate crisis, especially given that Canada was one of the few nations to vote against this declaration. Our active effort towards reconciliation takes place across Turtle Island through research, learning, teaching, and community building. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat while indicating a topic relevant to today's discussion and/or the land on which you reside. In this session, we will explore the climate crisis and adaptation impacts on mindsets. We might look at these issues through the lens of the SDGs, and more specifically, Goal 3, good health and well-being. That being said, we will also discuss the interconnectedness of these goals in meeting our personal and community wellness needs. Today, we strive to create a safer space to discuss lived realities and to prepare for the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead with climate adaptation. We respect that attendees are coming from different walks of life, and we are here to learn while offering support. Today's climate crisis conversation is not simply an abstract or intellectual exercise, but one based in embodied experiences and emotions for many in attendance. With this in mind, we want to make space for expressing the difficulties in how we face the climate crisis and hold space for the emotions and feelings that arise. Please do what you feel is needed to take care of yourself while being present for the duration of the session. With that, I would like to introduce myself and the esteemed panelists. My name is Jacqueline Willette, and I use she, her pronouns. I am the communications coordinator at SDSN Canada. I'm also a PhD candidate at UW studying sustainability management. My interest in mental health goes way back over a decade to when I became involved with Kids Help Phone. My current research investigates online communities related to sustainable lifestyles and feelings of inclusion and exclusion. I have also looked at health and sustainability communications with SSHRC-funded research on framing and negotiating the legitimacy of COVID-19 policies through social media. Kieran Mango is currently the community animator and resource activation specialist supporting the Tamarack Institute for Community Engagement. Kieran supports a long-term strategy that aims at activating resources to shift power to communities and develop root cause solutions. They have a background in sociology with a particular interest in equity, justice, power, and the nexus between communities and the organizations that serve them. Kieran's work spans a variety of interrelated challenges, from abolishing prisons to supporting just climate transitions. Veronica Niosan is a master's candidate in UW's climate change program. In her early years of environmental studies, she felt emotionally unprepared to face the field until realizing similar sentiments were common. After noticing a reluctance to talk about hope for the future, she decided to advocate for the normalization of that conversation. She renewed her sense of agency by working with the KW We Care Center and through her capstone project on the mental toll of climate change. She is now a co-founder of the Impossible Project, which is an initiative that fosters empowered minds to feel motivated to create positive change in the world. She also acts as a campus wellness student representative and engages with the president's anti-racism task force within the health working group. Tarek Harney is a student at U of T. He currently is studying anthropology and poli-sci and is interested in how these fields interact with sustainability and community development. He is also a director of operations the director of operations at Break the Divide, which is a network that inspires students to create change by fostering empathy and learning from one another through personal experience. Chloe St. Amand works as a collaboration and design thinking facilitator. She's completing her master's degree in social and ecological sustainability through the Collaborative Water Program at UW. Her research looks at the work of grassroots activists in Victoria, British Columbia, to advocate for sustainable wastewater treatment policies. She hopes that her work can help other activists make informed decisions on the most effective strategies for their sustainability campaigns. Let's start off with the panelists telling us a bit more about their work. How does it relate to the mindsets or wellness how does your work relate to the mindsets or wellness within the realm of climate change or sustainable solutions? We'll start with Tarek.
Thank you, Jacqueline. So I'm the Director of Operations at Break the Divide, and I kind of ended up getting involved with that following my second year of university, and especially coming out of the pandemic, myself and pretty much everyone else who works at Break the Divide were young university students, were volunteers, and we really felt this like feelings of helplessness and kind of not knowing where to go, who to contact, how to create change and deal with these issues that especially I think the pandemic exacerbated, but were like very present before that as well. So recently, like our new climate emotions, through like our new like climate emotions program, we've kind of gotten involved really in looking at how a youth kind of deal with the impacts of climate change and how the concept of like eco-grief, eco-anxiety influence how we understand climate change and how we actually deal with these issues. This like really kind of was just born out of this idea of this like these feelings that we're like, okay, we don't have anywhere to go with these emotions. We don't understand how to deal with them. And so kind of through our work, we're looking to provide youth with the tools to like confront these new realities. Thanks.
Great, thank you. How about you, Kieran?
Yeah, thank you, Jacqueline. Very grateful to be in the space today. Hi, everyone. My name is Kieran. As Jacqueline gave a great introduction, I use they, them pronouns. And I work as the community animator of resource activation at the Tamarack Institute. And in my role, I have the privilege of supporting our Community Climate Transitions Network, which I think really relates to this topic of mindsets and sort of how wellness relates to climate change, because really the foundation of our climate work and community climate transitions is really trying to reframe and rethink everyone's role in taking climate action. So we're really about thinking about how we can take a more sort of whole of community approach that really involves people across sectors and intentionally really centers resident-led action in the process. And so in that, we're really thinking through trying to, I think, maybe later in our conversation, we'll get into some of the issues around how we're talking about climate or how we think about climate action and how that exacerbates some of the issues around, how we think about mental health and climate change and stuff and the possibility of acting and stopping what really is all around us. And I think really the Climate Transitions Network, we're working across what we now call Canada with communities, really trying to think about how they can bring together different actors, whether they're influencers or, just everyday folks and stuff like that, and really move together and move the needle locally on making climate action possible and meeting their targets and creating plans in order to do so and be accountable to that. In addition to that work, I also am a community member and a community organizer, and I do a lot of work around a variety of issues. I wouldn't say climate is necessarily the focus of a lot of my community organizing, but I think it really has offered me an opportunity to really think about the whole individual. And I see climate coming across, whether I'm organizing around prisons and policing, or I'm organizing around, decent work and labor and, workers' justice and stuff like that. We see climate coming through in the conversations and the worries that people have in relation to whether we're talking about the Green Belt in what's now called Ontario, or just, the fire, the remnants of and the effects of the fires that are happening across so-called Canada right now. So it's been really interesting to think about the interconnections between the climate crisis and various issues, and see how that surfaces in everyday people's lives and how we can organize together because of it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Kieran. Veronica?
Yeah, thanks for the awesome introduction, by the way. As mentioned, my name is Veronica. My pronouns are she, they. In 2020, I co-founded the Impossible Project, which is really a student-run initiative, and it was inspired by a lot of environmentalist grief. So we took submitted stories about impossible things becoming possible to help boost morale and agency. And the reason why we decided to do that is because we recognize that there's this push, especially within, I think I'm within an environmentalist field. So sometimes when we're feeling overwhelmed, especially because of environmentalist crises and that sort of thing, we'll be told to go to a mental health professional, which I don't think it's bad advice, but when we go to these professionals, they don't fully understand the scope of what we're dealing with. Sometimes they'll be like, I know you're worried about climate change. Have you tried a breathing exercise? And it's like, I'm not saying that's bad advice, but it's also there's some things that it's this is not about putting a Band-Aid on the situation. There's some underlying things that are missing. And I think that's a space with people who are knowledgeable, or a space where people are knowledgeable on the actual climate issue or environmentalist issue, where they can convene and talk about how they actually feel. And I noticed that I didn't have that, and talking to some of my colleagues, I realized that they didn't have that either. And so we created this initiative, but it was also a way to bring people together and actually foster a space where we could talk about that informally, because we didn't have a formal space to do that. So yeah, that's how that began.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. And next we'll move on to Chloe.
Thanks, Jacqueline. So I'm Chloe, and my master's research is about grassroots activists who are within the sustainability realm. And something that comes up over and over again in my work is activist burnout, especially with grassroots activists who are working on their own, in comparison to people who are doing similar work through an NGO. Is that grassroots activists are doing this work often on top of full-time work and family responsibilities, which puts a lot more pressure on them compared to other people within the sphere. One person described to me how it felt like they were constantly going up against the machine that is government or corporations who can hire people to do this work for them. They can hire expertise and lawyers and consultants. So something that came up with a lot is how that affects these activists mentally and emotionally, because it's work that can have some really high highs, but can also have some very low lows. So people shared a lot of their stories with me about how difficult this work can be, especially if they're engaged with it over years or decades. And we talked a little bit also about strategies that can help alleviate that, like community and ways of cultivating hope. So it's definitely not a hopeless space, which is wonderful, but it is one that, as Veronica just mentioned, is not necessarily well understood by people who aren't in it.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for sharing more details on, how your work connects to these issues. The next question that we have is about media. So how do you think media, from televised news to social media, impacts climate-related feelings and perspectives? What are some pros and cons of having media around us for climate crisis conversations? So if we could start off with Chloe on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. This one specific conversation is something that I think we're seeing a little bit more often these days and more presence around it, which from my perspective is fantastic. And that is when we talk about climate change and the future, in general conversations, but especially in media arenas as well, there's this tendency to use a lot of language that invokes fear and despair. And now we have some psychological research that shows that not only does it make you feel bad and can impact your long-term mental health negatively, but it also doesn't really accomplish anything. It's not very motivating to communicate through despair and fear. Instead, what's been shown in the research is that a much more powerful mobilizing force is actually hope. And saying, yeah, this is a potential thing that can happen, but it doesn't have to be this way. Here are actions you can take. Here's work that's already being done, that sort of stuff. So thinking about how a lot of the time the conversations are disempowering and discourage people towards action and impact people negatively. But again, it doesn't have to be that way. And I am starting to see a tide shifting a little bit towards focusing on solution space and action, which is fantastic.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. Next, we have Tarek.
Yeah, thank you, Chloe and Jacqueline. So I've definitely, over like the past couple of years, seen, I think, both like the positive impacts that media and social media specifically can have on climate activism, and also how detrimental it can be to people's mental health. I lived in Alberta for a couple of years, and I actually found that having that access to social media, having that ability to connect with communities outside of that was really important to me, because I was living in a place that was definitely not somewhere where these discussions around climate change and mental health were necessarily always welcome or really accepted. At the same time, like recently, I'm a student at Victoria College at the University of Toronto, and this Victoria College has been very, very slow. They recently divested from fossil fuels, but has been very slow in divesting from fossil fuels. And there's been a lot of student activism around that, and a lot of that was supplemented by like social media and media in general. But there was also a huge amount of burnout, as Chloe was talking about, and it led to a lot of frustration, not just between like students and the administration, but also just within student groups, because students were simply getting to the point where they're like, there's nowhere left to go. We're exhausted. We feel like no one's actually listening to us, and certainly having this, like when you're a student activist, or when you're really any type of activist, you're so connected to what's happening both on social media, on the news, with regards to climate change, that it just becomes overwhelming when then you're working in this space as well. And so it can become just like, it can just become this like feedback cycle where you don't ever have an outlet to get out of it, because it is really important and you care about it so much. And at the same time, it's like, it is like controlling your life at the same time. So yeah, thank you.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. It definitely feels like you feed it because you know it's important. So you keep doing it. And then it's that cycle of just continuing with the push there. Yeah, for sure. Okay. Next we have Kieran.
Yeah, I'm loving what everyone's talking about. It's making my brain go in a bunch of directions and like want to stray from what I had originally thought about. One of the things that I think I'm thinking about, just staying on sort of that topic of social media, is I think we also need to be very sort of critical of the way that I think social media has changed how we relate to each other and how we engage with each other. I think one of the things about social media that's been great, like Tarek just said, like, is that like, it's allowed for people to, share stories, organize, and very much like, especially when mainstream media isn't covering particular actions or events, or, that isn't necessarily an outlet for us to talk about climate action and organizing in the way that we want to. It's a great opportunity, for people to take it into their own hands and to be able to, chart the narrative themselves. But at the same time, I think, we have to recognize that these platforms aren't supplementing, or they don't necessarily replace the conversations that we have in real life with other people. And I'm really concerned, I think, about the way in which that I think our use of social media and the way that it's almost come to replace some of those in-person conversations is heightening our sense of anxiety. One of the things I really think about is something that Charlie Cox from Climate Change Coaches shared with me a while back, that a big instigator of climate anxiety, for example, is believing that no one else cares. And I think one of the things that really she talked about when she made this statement was the fact that, a lot of us sometimes, especially when you go on social media or, when you post something, you might see, you might get responses to that post from climate deniers or, from people who might not necessarily have the exact same position on it. And I think in social media, there's not necessarily the opportunity for you to really have that in-depth discussion. And so it's very easy to make sort of a quick judgment, or for you to get into a space where you're just, being surrounded by, I think something that can make you spiral and make you go into, a worse emotional and mental state and stuff like that. And so I just am really kind of concerned about, I think, the way in which, especially, we're kind of thinking of social media sometimes as, maybe the only tool to have these conversations, and the need to really make sure that we're still having those in-person spaces to do that. Because, if we're only relying on social media, for example, to have these conversations, like, we lose a lot of nuance, but also we lose the ability to have disagreement, because I don't think social media is a great place to have disagreement. And we aren't going to necessarily be able to get into it, in a Twitter thread and stuff like that, especially when we don't have, the ability to really, I think, have this discussion maybe in a more human way, because these platforms are built in a way that is very much made for, hot takes or, for, polarization and stuff like that. And not to take up too much time, but I think just on the note of sort of the different forms of media, I really want to also just highlight, I think, the way in which I keep seeing very sort of mainstream media as deeply problematic and very much exacerbating kind of, like Chloe was saying, the feelings of anxiety and just the feelings of helplessness. I think mainstream media right now is very much like reporting on things in a very sanitized way, or often just taking like the statements of political officials as the news and not having any sort of analysis or any sort of critique. And that's a really, really big problem, because I think when you read an article, for example, like on the wildfires, there were so many articles that lacked any sort of connection to the climate crisis and did not make any sort of criticism of like government officials or government inaction and stuff like that, or, the corporations and stuff like that. And so I think, like when you're reading those articles and you don't see that critique involved, like it's very easy, like to come back to my previous point, to think, well, no one cares, or we're not doing anything. But that's obviously not true. It's just that analysis isn't being brought into the articles, and we're not highlighting that, or we're not talking to, the people who are organizing around that or doing that type of work. And so this is also just like, I think, a general call to journalists to really do that critical analysis work, because I don't think we're seeing heavy hitting journalism in a lot of the mainstream publications, although there are some great publications from like the National Observer to the Narwhal who are definitely doing that type of work. But again, those aren't necessarily like the CBCs or, the global news and stuff like that. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for all of that, Kieran. I have a lot of things I want to add, but we're going to move on to Veronica.
Yeah, that was really well said. And I think I have to echo some of this. I won't echo them because of time, but like I agree with this idea of there being a lot of polarization on social media. I know that I agree with Chloe had said something about like how a lot of things are sensationalized. I kind of want to add that I think a con of that is just overall avoidance. Like people are exhausted. Like I'll speak for myself, but I'm like, at some point I'm like, I don't want to, like, I'm literally studying climate change. Like I don't, like, when I avoid articles at this point now. And I think people, I feel like sometimes people are shocked when I tell them that, because in my first year in my undergrad, I had a professor who had said, like, you should be engaging in the media to be up to date. And I felt really bad because I was like, how do I, it's so sad out there. And like to like engage in the media in my free time and then go into school and then like have to study, like, and then I find that like the media, sometimes it's just telling me the same thing over and over again. Like this just in, climate change is a thing. Like, I know, we know, like, give me something different. And someone had told me like, there's this phrase, like, you are what you eat. And I used to just think it was about food, but it's like you consume so much, like through the media too. So I think about like how much I'm consuming negative news. And when I do consume the news, I try to think about like, what can I do with this information? And as I've done that more and more, I've realized that a lot of the news that makes me feel the worst is like on an international scale or a national scale, because I don't know what to do with it after. It's like the politics and the this and that. And like, yeah, I can vote and do that. But like there's just so much information. Sometimes people forget, like, you know, back in the day, making it sound like I'm older than I am, but like, we didn't always have so much information access at our fingertips. Like there was like once upon a time, like people, like if they wanted to know what was happening, they would have like, like a printed flyer or something like that. Or like they would just know about what was happening within their community, like their actual community. And then that would be like how they understand, how they connect with, what's happening in the world. And I feel like when I think about that, I feel better about only engaging in like local media, because I'm like, at least I can do stuff that I might see the impact of on a local level. When I start to engage on like an international level and that sort of thing, I feel more and more helpless. And that's a thing that I feel like is like a downside to having so much information. Like it's great because we can share so much, but it's just like you have to take care of like your capacity in order to like actually be productive. I have so much more to say, but maybe I'll just like put a pin in it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Honestly, I feel the same, but yeah, we have so many questions, but that was a really great contribution. I think thinking about the scales that we see, even our ability to impact things and the scale of the stories and where we see our power in that is definitely an important thing to consider, and how we see that like hope, how we can manifest, the hope that Chloe was kind of discussing there. So we'll move on to the next question, which is, in your opinion, what types of strategies can people use to act on climate change while also addressing their own limitations? So we'll start off with Veronica.
Yeah, I think I mean, I did talk about this a bit about like recognizing your own capacity. I used to I did this thing where I asked people like what makes them hopeful for the future. And I've noticed this trend about like people who are a bit older. They'll say like, oh, like the next generation. And I think that's, it's a real answer. They truly believe that. But then I also started realizing that I gotta be honest, I feel like finding hope in the future in other people is a bit of a cop-out. I feel like it's a cop-out because it's not taking accountability for your role in whatever challenges are happening that you're worried about. And I wish that we were able to find better ways to recognize our own agency by doing things within our own, like within the scope of our own lives. Let me rephrase that. So I feel like there's hope that's productive and there's hope that's not productive. I feel like not productive hope focuses more on the external. And I think that can be problematic because a lot of these issues are external. It's like you're recognizing fear and things that you're worried about and things that you're not able to control. You're recognizing that externally, and then you're also finding hope externally. And I feel like that can be dangerous because if your hope is external, then you have no control over it. When you have your hope grounded in something that you're doing, then you're reclaiming your agency. And I think that a way that we can do that, I think a way that we can do that is to really think about what climate change means to us and what our biggest fear with climate change is. Somebody gave a really good example, and they said, like, climate change is like, if you've ever seen Harry Potter, there's these things called, I think they're called the Dementors, and they just manifest as like your biggest fear. And someone told me that like climate change is like the Dementor, like it manifests as your biggest fear. Like if you're scared of, sea level rise, then like climate change is sea level rise. If you're scared about, air quality, like, not being able to breathe, like climate change is that. And like for me, I recognize that climate change was scary to me because I was worried that my family wouldn't get the help that they need because they were already discriminated against because of like their sort of positionality. And so I recognize that for me to address climate change in a way that was meaningful, I had to focus on the things that I was already terrified about and then pour my energy into that. Even if it's not like explicitly climate change related, I know that people who are more, vulnerable or marginalized or, they're in precarious housing situations, they will be the most impacted by climate change. So climate change related or not, one of the things that I do to feel more hopeful and to feel more agency is to help people who maybe have similar lived experiences to me or that sort of thing, who are dealing with really hard housing situations. And that links to climate change. So the cool thing about climate, well, not to say that this is cool, but like the interesting thing about climate change is it impacts everything, like every industry, like, which can be a scary thing, but it's also just like, this feels very empowering. Like there are so many ways for you to engage with this issue within the scope of your life if you recognize why you're like, what your power is, what you know, and like what you're worried about, and just sort of find the intersections there. I talked a lot, so I'm gonna pause and let someone else jump in, maybe Chloe.
Yeah, honestly, that was amazing. I had chills. Like that was very inspiring. Thank you for sharing that. I think next we have, yes, Chloe. Chloe, if you'd like to speak to.
Oh man, yeah. Thanks, Veronica. There's so many jumping off points that I could go off of on that. The thing that I think comes up again and again and again in my work is the importance of doing this work in community. Because if you're doing this on your own, you're way more likely to slip into doom spirals. You're going to get burnt out a lot faster. And you also just, on a pure pragmatic sense, you also won't be as effective doing this on your own than doing this with other people. And additionally, to do it in community, focusing on a more local scale is something that is a lot more hopeful and doable and impactful for most people. There are a lot of interventions you could be doing at the provincial, national, international scale for sure, but even just doing things like getting involved in your next municipal election can be huge. Within the case study that I'm looking at, the biggest turning point was a municipal election when activists decided to run for office and then got elected and could directly impact local policy, which then kind of acted as a template for policy to be changed at the provincial level. So even just doing things like that can be a way to do work and have impact that is very tangible and can be done on a much shorter scale than some of the more international policies. Additionally, I want to just really underscore the fact that you do not have to be a hero and you don't have to be doing the same intensity of work your entire life. All aspects of our life will change and ebb and flow. And we do not have to be doing the most all the time. Sometimes you will be leading the charge on something because you have specific kind of expertise or experience that lends itself to that. But there's also a lot of power in helping someone campaign for their run for office, or even just making a meal for someone, or having conversations with someone in person, with your family, with your friends. Actions don't have to be everything all at once. It can be a little bit here, a little bit there, and balancing that with the capacity you have for the other parts of your life as well. Because again, this is only one aspect of our lives and we're in it for the long game. So trying to manage your energy over time, which of course is something that's much, much easier said and done. But you can shift that slowly over time if you try to be conscious of it and practice and maybe have an accountability buddy.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. I love the idea of an accountability buddy. That's very interesting. Like checking in on people, and yeah, I like that. I see that there is a hand raised for Veronica.
I just wanted to add to something that Chloe said about like you don't have to do the whole like the thing about like you don't have to put in the same intensity for the rest of your life. Somebody gave me like a very good example of like they're a singer, like they're a professional singer, and I was asking them like how do people hold their notes for so long? And then they explained to me that like when they sing within a group, they have two people, at least two people, singing the same note. And then when somebody needs to breathe, the other person keeps the note going, and then like vice versa. And so it sounds like the note is just being held forever. And I thought that was just such a great metaphor for like the work that we put in for like climate change or any big initiative that like is like that needs collaboration, because we get burnt out. Like it's true. Like, and Chloe had mentioned, like you have to be careful about the burnout because like we can't do all this stuff alone. But when you need to rest, it's also important that you trust that there's other people that are still going to like lift, like do some of the work, and then vice versa. Like there's no one can do this alone, and it's important that we lean on each other as we get through this together.
Great. Yeah, thank you for building on that. I do want to say we are approaching the 10 minutes left mark. We do have some more questions, so I'm going to leave it up to the panelists on, what kind of elements they want to speak to with the remaining time, specifically going to Kieran next. So just to present the next question, just in case, I think that was one that you were really kind of excited to maybe discuss. That's regarding it's the question of how can communities prepare to support mental health impacts of the mental health impacts of climate change? What systems need to change, or what systems are already in place?
Yeah, great. I'm just changing. I'm taking a second to change my brain from I was thinking about the last conversation, and now I'm flipping to this
Honestly, the
question.
last conversation was really interesting. If you want to keep building on that, I'm good to go for those questions. I don't want to miss out on that question because I knew you were like, I'm ready for that one. So whatever your preference is, yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think there's something actually that emerged from the conversation that like flows nicely into this question. And I think one of the things I'm thinking about is really being honest about what this work looks like. And when I say that, I think it's really about like the fact that like there is a lot of groundwork that goes into taking action, or what it looks like to act, right? And being very honest about sort of I think this sort of sense of ebbs and flows, and times when you're going to put a lot of work in, and then there are times when it's not going to put a lot of work in. And so when we talk about like supporting the mental health impacts of climate change, or just like taking climate action or something like that, like there's an ebb and flow to it almost as well that flows with like the work itself. One of the things that I was in conversation one time and with someone, and we had a really interesting conversation about how oftentimes, like when you're in a protest, for example, or when you're doing something, you feel very invincible, or like you feel like sometimes like very empowered, or like it's sometimes very easy to or like in those instances, you might not necessarily have the same sort of intense feelings that you have when you're sitting on your phone late at night reading an article in bed kind of thing, feeling like, oh my goodness, the gravity of this, and I'm just sitting here kind of thing. Or you're in the middle of planning your next action, or like your next like community event and stuff like that, and it's like a couple of weeks away kind of thing, and it's like, what am I doing now? And so I think one of the things I really wanted to center was the importance of process and understanding that, and being clear like with yourself that is part of the work and that is part of acting. Not all of the action that you're going to be taking is hyper visible, and like not all of the action is going to be something that like is going to be reportable, or necessarily leading to something that is very tangible in terms of like making a change or something like that. But like seeing that sort of process work and that groundwork as part of that action is really, really important, and being honest about that and building in things around that process work so that you can bring in mental health into the conversation. So whether it is rest, whether it is, ways that you can make that sort of process work feel more meaningful, or at least open up the conversation around like how people are feeling when it's maybe a downtime, is something that I see as super, super important when we're talking about, taking climate action or organizing with a group. One of the other things I think as well in stating that is really avoiding something called urgency culture. I think that is something that we often really, really struggle with, and that leads to burnout. It leads to, feelings of helplessness, is just, like really jumping into that. We just need to take action right now and everything is urgent. That kind of mentality is really hard to sometimes grapple with, but really making it clear that if everything is urgent, nothing is urgent. And also the fact that we also don't want to reproduce the same mindsets and thinking that has put us in this mess, which I think urgency culture is wrapped up in all of that. And this feeling of there's no time and that we just need to jump straight to action. It prevents us from making relationships. It prevents us from organizing a community. It makes us feel like we're the only one, right? But it's really important to do that groundwork and to really give ourselves the abundance and time that often we don't necessarily feel like we have based on the scale of what's happening and the way that it's reported on. But we need to make space for that. And we need to make space as, communities, as people organizing, as people doing this work. If we're organizing a space or we're creating an opportunity for people to come together, we need to prioritize that when doing that. Okay, I think I tied together a bunch of things that I was thinking about for both those questions. So I'm going to pause here and pass it over to maybe Tariq.
Yeah, sure. So Tariq, on either of the questions, if you wanted to just have the last few minutes and then I'm going to conclude. And yeah, so if you have any other points you want to add.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, folks. That I have, my brain's kind of all over the place because you all made some amazing points I really couldn't agree more with. There was something Veronica said that I really related to, in that I think there's this tendency, especially when you talk to older generations, even I think amongst our generation, because of how exhausting climate activism can be, to say, to kind of push the climate crisis and all this stuff that's happening to somewhere else. It's happening somewhere else. It's going to be happening. In the moment, I can focus on something else. And that absolutely, we do need to recognize our limitations. But at the same time, I remember I was sitting at, I was talking to my grandparents actually, and I was telling them about some climate activism I was doing at the time, and they're like, "Oh, it's saving the rainforest." And I thought that was so indicative of how how older generations still think of we often as a society still think about climate change, in that it's something that's far away and over there, and it literally the way we think about saving rainforests reinforces all these colonial structures that don't just perpetuate climate change. It perpetuates racial injustice, economic I'm blanking on the word, stratification. It just, and I think this kind of also leads into why how community activism can, how we can become more effective at community activism, is that look, every community is going to have a different understanding of how climate change impacts them and why climate change is impacting them, and what the potential solutions are going to be. Before coming to university, I was living in rural Alberta, and there's a very different understanding of why climate change is happening, where is it even happening, according in that space. And so if we're going to actually if we're going to be able to have effective conversations about this stuff, we have to be able to engage, find ways to frame climate change through community values and through shared community values, which is obviously not easy, especially when again, it's very easy to become nihilistic, whether it's just doom scrolling, or even personal experiences. I've had experiences where it's stop, you're crazy, the carbon tax is useless, climate change isn't happening. That definitely happens. It's very discouraging because these are issues that if you believe in climate change, it's absolutely something that provokes a lot of anxiety. So yeah, sorry, anyway, so kind of trying to wrap up, I think it's it's just really important to like kind of acknowledge your limitations, acknowledge, for example, that like often there is maybe someone who's better positioned to engage with another community or has more capacity to do that just because it's like less exhausting. For example, like, I mean, like as a straight man, it's much easier for me to, for example, engage with a room full of hockey players who don't believe in climate change than it would be for someone with a different positionality, because I don't have to deal with ingrained prejudices that often would exist in that type of space, right? And so like, I guess, and then in the same way, like I would be less have like less capacity or like less experience in dealing in other spaces. So I think like, yeah, just sorry, I all over the place, but just, yeah, acknowledge like that positionality is really important when we're talking about this type of issue. And that can also help us have more energy to then and be more effective in our own activism.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for that contribution. It's really interesting to see that, we're talking about the psychological distance that happens both in time, when you're talking about your grandparents' generation, but also in space, if we're thinking about the rainforest and that's something distant versus Canada, like that, the psychological and physical distance from these things. And then there's also the other side of the spectrum where you have the urgency and thinking about what you can do and is on you. And so just trying to find that balance and taking care of yourself kind of while you find that balance, I think is really important. So thank you everybody for coming today. I really wanted to have time for a Q&A, but I think they're going to cut me off. So thank you all. I just wanted to say a few quick things. So I would like to thank the panelists for taking the time to share their knowledge and experiences with us. I'm certain that attendees agree that your insights have been both hopeful and helpful as we try to move forward on this shared planet together. I would also like to thank everyone who joined this session. As someone who cares deeply about the topics we discussed here today, it is inspiring to know that so many other people see the value of such conversations. I'm really excited about one of the next sessions on the inclusive physical space framework. And I'm just going to add the link to the chat in case anyone else is also interested. And with that, I hope you enjoy the rest of the Together Ensemble conference and have a great weekend. And if there are any other things you want to kind of add, throw it in the chat. Yeah, but thank you, everybody.